Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. This book consists of 31 chapters and it is 933 pages long. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. Many years ago, before the days of the story of philosophy, Will Durant planned to write a history of the 19th century. He started to work on it, only to find that his subject could be understood only in terms of what had come before. His research gradually led him into the formation of a plan for writing a history of all civilization, ancient and modern, Occidental and Oriental. His enthusiasm was further spurred by 2 trips around the world, and particularly by an intensive study of the history of the Far East. Here, then, is the first volume of this story of civilization, Our Oriental Heritage, complete in itself. Dr. Durant worked on it steadily from 1927 to 1932, and the book represents the 3rd complete rewriting. Our Oriental Heritage deals first with the establishment of civilization, and then takes up, not in rapid review but in rich and fascinating detail, the colorful, complex dramas of the Near East, India and her neighbors, and the Far East. The story is carried up to mid-1930s. Every one of the thousands of facts in Our Oriental Heritage has been checked and double-checked, but as a safeguard against possible errors, extra copies of the manuscript were made and sent to many specialists, including Professor Harry Wolfson of Harvard, Dr. Ananda Kumaraswamy of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and Professor H. Gowan of the University of Washington. This volume, then, begins with a chapter on the nature and conditions of civilization, offers a 109-page introduction on the establishment of civilization, an attempt to meet Voltaire's demand, "I want to know what were the steps by which men passed from barbarism to civilization." It goes on to record the cultural history, the economic and political organization, the science and art, the religion and morals, the literature and philosophy, the customs and manners of Sumeria, Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, Judea, and Persia to their conquest by Alexander, and narrates the history of civilization in India, from the Vedas to Mahatma Gandhi, in China from Confucius to Chiang Kai-shek, and in Japan from the earliest times to mid-1930s. Those who have read Our Oriental Heritage have compared it, and the series of which it is a part, with the great work of the French encyclopedists of the 18th century. The story of civilization represents the most comprehensive attempt in our times to embrace the vast panorama of man's history and culture. Dedication to Ariel. Preface. I have tried in this book to accomplish the first part of a pleasant assignment which I rashly laid upon myself some 20 years ago, to write a history of civilization. I wish to tell as much as I can, in as little space as I can, of the contributions that genius and labor have made to the cultural heritage of mankind, to chronicle and contemplate in their causes, character, and effects the advances of invention, the varieties of economic organization, the experiments in government, the aspirations of religion, the mutations of morals and manners, the masterpieces of literature, the development of science, the wisdom of philosophy, and the achievements of art. I do not need to be told how absurd this enterprise is, nor how immodest is its very conception, for many years of effort have brought it to but a fifth of its completion, and have made it clear that no one mind and no single lifetime can adequately compass this task. Nevertheless, I have dreamed that despite the many errors inevitable in this undertaking, it may be of some use to those upon whom the passion for philosophy has laid the compulsion to try to see things whole, to pursue perspective, unity, and understanding through history in time, as well as to seek them through science in space. I have long felt that our usual method of writing history in separate longitudinal sections, economic history, political history, religious history, the history of philosophy, the history of literature, the history of science, the history of music, the history of art, does injustice to the unity of human life. That history should be written collaterally as well as lineally, synthetically as well as analytically, and that the ideal historiography would seek to portray in each period the total complex of a nation's culture, institutions, adventures, and ways. But the accumulation of knowledge has divided history, like science, into 1,000 isolated specialties. The prudent scholars have refrained from attempting any view of the whole, whether of the material universe or of the living past of our race. For the probability of error increases with the scope of the undertaking, and any man who sells his soul to synthesis will be a tragic target for a myriad merry darts of specialist critique. "Consider," said Ptahhotep 5,000 years ago, "how thou mayest be opposed by an expert in counsel. It is foolish to speak on every kind of work." A history of civilization shares the presumptuousness of every philosophical enterprise. It offers the ridiculous spectacle of a fragment expounding the whole. Like philosophy, such a venture has no rational excuse, and is at best but a brave stupidity. But let us hope that, like philosophy, it will always lure some rash spirits into its fatal depths. The plan of the series is to narrate the history of civilization in 5 independent parts. 1. Our Oriental Heritage, a history of civilization in Egypt and the Near East to the death of Alexander, and in India, China, and Japan to the present day, with an introduction on the nature and elements of civilization. 2. Our Classical Heritage, a history of civilization in Greece and Rome, and of civilization in the Near East under Greek and Roman domination. 3. Our Medieval Heritage, Catholic and feudal Europe, Byzantine civilization, Mohammedan and Judaic culture in Asia, Africa, and Spain, and the Italian Renaissance. 4. Our European Heritage, the cultural history of the European states from the Protestant Reformation to the French Revolution. 5. Our Modern Heritage, the history of European invention and statesmanship, science and philosophy, religion and morals, literature and art from the accession of Napoleon to our own times. Our story begins with the Orient, not merely because Asia was the scene of the oldest civilizations known to us, but because those civilizations formed the background and basis of that Greek and Roman culture which Sir Henry Maine mistakenly supposed to be the whole source of the modern mind. We shall be surprised to learn how much of our most indispensable inventions, our economic and political organization, our science and our literature, our philosophy and our religion, goes back to Egypt and the Orient. At this historic moment, when the ascendancy of Europe is so rapidly coming to an end, when Asia is swelling with resurrected life, and the theme of the 20th century seems destined to be an all-embracing conflict between the East and the West, the provincialism of our traditional histories, which began with Greece and summed up Asia in a line, has become no merely academic error, but a possibly fatal failure of perspective and intelligence. The future faces into the Pacific, and understanding must follow it there. But how shall an Occidental mind ever understand the Orient? 8 years of study and travel have only made this too more evident, that not even a lifetime of devoted scholarship would suffice to initiate a Western student into the subtle character and secret lore of the East. Every chapter, every paragraph in this book will offend or amuse some patriotic or esoteric soul. The Orthodox Jew will need all his ancient patience to forgive the pages on Yahweh. The metaphysical Hindu will mourn this superficial scratching of Indian philosophy, and the Chinese or Japanese sage will smile indulgently at these brief and inadequate selections from the wealth of Far Eastern literature and thought. Some of the errors in the chapter on Judea have been corrected by Professor Harry Wolfson of Harvard. Dr. Ananda Kumaraswamy of the Boston University of Fine Arts has given the section on India a most painstaking revision, but must not be held responsible for the conclusions I have reached or the errors that remain. Professor H. Gowan, the learned Orientalist of the University of Washington, and Upton Close, whose knowledge of the Orient seems inexhaustible, have checked the more flagrant mistakes in the chapters on China and Japan. And Mr. George Sokolsky has given to the pages on contemporary affairs in the Far East the benefit of his first-hand information. Should the public be indulgent enough to call for a second edition of this book, the opportunity will be taken to incorporate whatever further corrections may be suggested by critics, specialists, and readers. Meanwhile, a weary author may sympathize with Tai Tung, who in the 13th century issued his History of Chinese Writing with these words, "Were I to await perfection, my book would never be finished." Since these ear-minded times are not propitious for the popularity of expensive books on remote subjects of interest only to citizens of the world, it may be that the continuation of this series will be delayed by the prosaic necessities of economic life. But if the reception of this adventure in synthesis makes possible an uninterrupted devotion to the undertaking, Part 2 should be ready by the fall of 1940, and its successors should appear, by the grace of health, at 5-year intervals thereafter. Nothing would make me happier than to be freed for this work from every other literary enterprise. I shall proceed as rapidly as time and circumstance will permit, hoping that a few of my contemporaries will care to grow old with me while learning, and that these volumes may help some of our children to understand and enjoy the infinite riches of their inheritance. Will Durant, Great Neck, New York, March 1935. Acknowledgments. I am grateful to the following authors and publishers for permission to quote from their books: W. E. Leonard, Gilgamesh, The Viking Press; H. A. Giles, A History of Chinese Literature, D. Appleton Century Company; Edna Worthley Underwood, Tu Fu, The Mosher Press. Arthur Waley, 170 Chinese Poems, Alfred A. Knopf. James H. Breasted, The Development of Religion and Thought in Ancient Egypt, Scribner's. Shigeyoshi Obata, Works of Li Po, E. P. Dutton. Eunice Tietjens, Poetry of the Orient, Alfred A. Knopf. Mark Van Doren, Anthology of World Poetry, The Literary Guild. Upton Close, Unpublished Translations of